There is a building in Melbourne that refuses to make sense. The Royal Exhibition Building in Carlton Gardens stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a massive cruciform structure spanning over 12,000 square meters, its dome rising 42 meters above the polished timber floor. Built in 1880 for the Melbourne International Exhibition and completed in a reported 18 months, it remains one of the largest 19th-century exhibition halls in the world. The dome alone weighs over 600 tons. The building contains no internal support columns in its main hall, a clear span of over 50 meters in an era when structural steel was supposedly in its infancy in the colonies. But here is the thing that architectural guides do not discuss: the detail that tour groups walk beneath without ever looking up. The building was wired, not wired for electricity in the sense we understand it. The 1880 exhibition catalogues describe something they called the electrical annex, a dedicated section for what they termed scientific apparatus. The official records note that the building featured arc lighting throughout, hundreds of arc lamps illuminating the exhibition halls at night. This was 1880, in a colonial city at the edge of the known world. A city that, according to standard infrastructure history, would not have a functional public electricity supply until 1894, 14 years later. The question is not whether the lights worked. Contemporary accounts from multiple newspapers confirm they did. The question is what powered them during the exhibition, and whether the infrastructure built to support them extended beyond temporary demonstration. The official explanation is straightforward and well documented. The Melbourne International Exhibition of 1880 featured electrical demonstrations powered by portable steam-driven generators brought specifically for the event. The arc lighting was a spectacular but temporary display, designed to showcase the latest European and American technologies to colonial audiences. After the exhibition closed, the generators were removed. The lighting was dismantled. Melbourne returned to gas lamps until the gradual rollout of conventional electrical infrastructure in the 1890s. This explanation fits neatly into the standard narrative of technological progress: isolated demonstrations preceding systematic adoption, temporary marvels giving way to permanent systems as capital and expertise accumulated in the colonies. What this explanation does not fully account for is the architectural evidence. The Royal Exhibition Building was not constructed as a temporary fairground. It was built of brick, steel, timber, and stone, designed to last centuries, and it has. The electrical systems were not entirely bolted on as afterthoughts. Photographs from the construction period show conduit channels built directly into the walls, brass fittings embedded in the decorative plasterwork, junction boxes positioned at regular intervals beneath the ornamental ceiling roses. These could be marks of optimistic planning, builders preparing for a future they anticipated but had not yet realized, or they could represent something more immediate. The question is not whether temporary generators powered the exhibition lights. The question is whether the permanent infrastructure suggests intentions that extended beyond a single event. But this was only one element of what Melbourne built in that decade. The 1880s saw Melbourne grow faster than almost any city in history. Between 1880 and 1890, the population more than doubled, from roughly 200,000 to over 400,000. Construction exploded across the city, not just houses, but massive civic buildings, underground railway stations, elaborate sewerage systems, and something else. Something that appears in engineering documents of the period, but has been incompletely documented in subsequent accounts. The city installed an extensive network of underground conduits. These conduits appear in municipal records with descriptions that vary, some identified as telegraph channels, others as future utility corridors, and some marked simply as electrical service preparation. Consider the numbers for a moment. Melbourne in 1880 had a total municipal budget of approximately £800,000. The Royal Exhibition building alone cost over £200,000, a quarter of the entire city budget, though this was financed partly through special exhibition bonds and private subscriptions rather than purely municipal funds. The underground conduit system, according to fragmentary records from the Melbourne City Council archives, was constructed in phases between 1881 and 1889 at a cost variously estimated between £150,000 and £340,000. These figures are difficult to verify completely, as some costs were bundled with other infrastructure projects like sewerage and road works. What is clear is that significant underground construction occurred during this period, construction whose purpose was not always clearly documented in records that have survived. The through line here is the conduit, the brass fitting in the wall, the channel built into plaster that was meant to last forever. These are not theoretical objects, they are physical evidence, measured in millimeters, photographed in archives, present beneath the streets and within the walls of buildings that still stand. What remains unclear is their original intended purpose, and whether that purpose was fully realized. Before you dismiss this as colonial record-keeping error or confusion between planned and actual infrastructure, follow the specific evidence that does exist. Not speculation, the evidence, because the next detail complicates everything that comes before it. In 1888, Melbourne hosted the Centennial International Exhibition in the same Royal Exhibition building. The official catalogue from this event, held in the State Library of Victoria, reference number H2009.111/1, contains a section on electrical apparatus that runs to over 200 pages. It describes not merely generators and arc lamps, but includes references to what appears to be described as an extended electrical demonstration network connecting the exhibition building to several nearby commercial buildings. The language in the catalogue is sometimes ambiguous, mixing descriptions of what was demonstrated with what was operational, making it difficult to determine whether this represents a functioning permanent system or an expanded temporary exhibition installation. What is clear is that the 1888 exhibition featured considerably more electrical infrastructure than the 1880 event, and that this infrastructure appeared to extend beyond the exhibition building itself. The catalogue lists buildings that were included in electrical demonstrations during the exhibition period: the Melbourne Town Hall, the Princess Theatre, several commercial buildings in the immediate vicinity of the exhibition grounds. The list suggests a network of demonstration sites, though whether these represented permanent connections or temporary exhibition links remains ambiguous in the source material. What we can say is that electrical power was being transmitted to multiple buildings during the 1888 exhibition, and that this represented a significant expansion from the isolated generator model of 1880, what we call the delayed electrification of Melbourne, the narrative that electricity arrived gradually to the colonies, that Australia was technologically dependent on Britain and America, that the modern grid emerged only through the slow accumulation of foreign expertise, is more complicated than a simple binary of presence or absence. The conduits exist. The wiring channels exist. The exhibition catalogues describing expanded electrical demonstrations exist. What is less clear is the distinction between demonstration infrastructure and permanent systems, between ambitious planning and actual implementation, between what was built for temporary exhibition purposes and what was intended for ongoing use. The standard response to this kind of evidence is to invoke temporary installations, exhibition fever, colonial enthusiasm outrunning practical implementation. This explanation has merit. Temporary installations built to permanent specifications are not unknown in the history of world's fairs and international exhibitions. The question is whether all the evidence fits this explanation, or whether some elements suggest something more sustained. Temporary installations do not always require underground conduit systems that remain intact 140 years later. Temporary installations do not always get built into load-bearing walls with the precision visible in period photographs. The infrastructure exists in a strange middle space, too permanent for pure exhibition architecture, yet apparently too incomplete for a fully operational city-wide system. Something was happening in Melbourne in the 1880s, something that left physical evidence in multiple locations, and then either was not completed as planned or was completed and then dismantled. The question is not whether it existed in some form. The conduits prove that infrastructure was built. The question is what that infrastructure was intended to accomplish and why its trajectory changed. One possible answer begins in 1893, during the event that history calls the Australian banking crisis. In 1893, 13 of Australia's trading banks suspended operations, though not all permanently collapsed. This represented roughly half of the banking sector, by some measures, less by others, depending on how institutions are counted. In that same year, references to expanded electrical infrastructure in Melbourne City Council archives become notably less detailed. Not that all records disappear entirely, but the character of documentation changes. Earlier records from the 1880s contain detailed technical specifications, cost breakdowns, and planning documents. Records from 1893 onwards tend toward maintenance notes and brief administrative references, without the technical detail of earlier years. We might call this infrastructure disruption during economic crisis. We might call it the natural result of capital exhaustion during the 1890s depression. We might call it the reorganization of civic priorities under financial pressure. All of these explanations have some validity. The banking crisis of the 1890s was severe. Melbourne's boom period ended. Many ambitious projects were abandoned or indefinitely postponed. But this does not entirely explain why certain records become less detailed while the infrastructure itself apparently remained in place. The conduits were not removed. They were not filled in. They were not immediately repurposed for other utilities in any systematic way that appears in subsequent documentation. Core samples taken during modern construction projects in central Melbourne, documented in archaeological site reports from 2006 onwards, including reports filed with Heritage Victoria, show that underground conduit systems from the 1880s remain largely intact beneath certain streets, empty, disconnected from modern utilities, but intact. Whatever was intended to run through those channels either never was installed permanently or was installed and then removed, or operated briefly and was abandoned. The channels themselves were left, as if someone expected to need them again or simply had no resource to remove them during the Depression years. The through line is the conduit, but the conduit leads to ambiguity rather than certainty. The question of why these conduits have never been systematically studied leads not to conspiracy, but to something far more mundane. The structure of how knowledge gets funded, categorized, and rewarded in modern academic institutions. Consider the position of a researcher at the University of Melbourne or Monash University who becomes interested in the pre-Federation electrical infrastructure of Australian cities. Their first obstacle is not suppression. Their first obstacle is categorization. Where does this research belong? It is not quite archaeology, because the period falls within documented history, and archaeology programs prioritize older material. It is not quite engineering history, because engineering history as a discipline focuses on successful implementations, patents, named inventors, and clear technical lineages. And the conduit system appears incompletely in these frameworks. It is not quite urban studies, because urban studies concerns itself primarily with social patterns and policy outcomes rather than orphaned infrastructure. It falls into the gaps between disciplines, and in modern academic funding, the gaps between disciplines are where questions become difficult to pursue. The Australian Research Council, which funds the majority of research in the humanities and social sciences, operates on a competitive grant system that rewards projects with clear methodological frameworks, established theoretical foundations, and demonstrable relevance to contemporary policy concerns or scholarly debates. A proposal to investigate whether 19th century Australian cities possessed electrical distribution systems that were more extensive than currently documented would face several hurdles. The proposal would need to identify which discipline it contributes to, what established scholarly conversation it joins, and what methodology it would employ. Without existing peer-reviewed literature asking similar questions, without an established methodological precedent, the proposal would be evaluated against projects that fit more neatly into recognized categories. This is not conspiracy. This is the natural operation of a competitive funding system that necessarily prioritizes questions that can be clearly situated within existing scholarly frameworks. The peer review system compounds this structural issue. Academic careers advance through publication in peer-reviewed journals. Peer-reviewed journals in history, archaeology, and engineering history have established standards for what constitutes acceptable evidence, acceptable questions, and acceptable methodologies. A paper arguing that conduit systems beneath central Melbourne represent previously undocumented electrical infrastructure would need to meet several criteria. It would need to demonstrate that the conduits could not be explained as remnants of other utility systems. It would need to provide material evidence beyond the existence of the conduits themselves. Chemical analysis showing electrical residues, documentary evidence of operation beyond temporary exhibitions, financial records showing ongoing operational costs. Without this additional evidence, the paper would likely be evaluated as speculative, and reviewers would reasonably suggest that the author develop the evidential basis further before publication. This is not active suppression. This is the normal operation of academic quality control, which necessarily errs toward caution when claims challenge established narratives without comprehensive supporting evidence. Then there is the matter of access. The conduits beneath Melbourne exist on land owned by state governments, local councils, and private corporations. Accessing them for research purposes requires permits, insurance, safety assessments, and the cooperation of multiple bureaucratic entities. The Victorian Department of Transport and Planning, which controls access to much underground infrastructure in Melbourne, has approval processes designed for maintenance, safety inspection, and development purposes. A researcher requesting access to conduct historical investigation would need to identify which category of access their work falls under. Historical research is not a standard category in infrastructure access protocols. The request would require navigation of multiple bureaucratic channels, each with different requirements and approval authorities. This is not deliberate obstruction. This is the normal complexity of accessing operational infrastructure in a modern city, where safety and liability necessarily take precedence over historical curiosity. There is also professional risk to consider, though perhaps less dramatic than conspiracy thinking suggests. An academic who publicly argues that Australian cities possessed electrical infrastructure significantly more advanced or extensive than currently recognized would not face active persecution, but would face professional skepticism. Their work would be scrutinized more carefully. Their interpretations would be questioned more thoroughly. Other researchers might not cite their work, not out of coordinated suppression, but out of reasonable caution about building on foundations that remain contested. This is not coordinated silencing. This is the natural conservatism of a profession that advances through cumulative consensus rather than individual breakthrough claims. The researcher would not be forbidden from asking questions. They would simply find that answering those questions definitively requires resources, access, and collaborative support that are difficult to obtain for topics that exist outside established scholarly conversations. And so the conduits remain, largely unstudied in detail, beneath streets that see daily traffic without awareness of what lies below. The technology that could clarify this question is neither expensive nor exotic. It exists, it is available, and it has been used for similar purposes in other contexts. The question is not whether we could investigate the conduits systematically. The question is whether anyone with the necessary combination of access, funding, and professional positioning has sufficient motivation to do so. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, can map subsurface structures to depths of several meters with resolution sufficient to identify individual conduit channels, junction points, and the composition of surrounding materials. A systematic GPR survey of areas where 1880s conduit infrastructure is known to exist, beneath Collins Street, beneath Elizabeth Street, beneath Bourke Street, would produce a detailed three-dimensional map of the network. This technology is routinely used in urban planning, archaeological investigation, and utility location services. It is not restricted. A survey of this kind would cost somewhere between $30,000 and $100,000 depending on scope, requiring multiple site permits and coordination with traffic management authorities. The technology exists. The cost is modest by research standards. No comprehensive systematic survey has been funded or conducted, likely because no single institution sees this question as falling within their core research mandate or having priority within competitive funding environments. More specifically, X-ray fluorescence spectrometry could analyze the material composition of conduit walls without requiring samples to be removed. If the conduits were designed for electrical transmission, their walls might show specific material signatures, particular ratios of conductive or insulating compounds, mineral deposits consistent with electrical current exposure, or chemical residues from insulation materials used in early electrical systems. XRF analysis is non-destructive, portable, and widely available in archaeological and materials science contexts. A research team with permitted access to even one section of the conduit system could conduct preliminary analysis within hours. This has not been done, most likely because gaining access requires navigating multiple bureaucratic approval processes for a research question that does not fall within established priorities for any single approval authority. Thermographic imaging could potentially detect residual thermal signatures in conduit walls, patterns that would indicate where sustained heat exposure once occurred, possibly from electrical current or from other sources. Thermal imaging of this kind is commercially available and used in building inspection and industrial monitoring. Applied to the conduit system, it might show anomalous heat patterns, though interpreting such patterns after more than a century would require caution. This analysis has not been conducted, again likely due to access limitations and absence of institutional funding for a research question outside established categories. Even simpler in principle would be core sampling of conduit walls at strategic locations, at sites of former junction points visible on historical utility maps, at locations where conduits appear to connect to major buildings, at areas where architectural plans suggest concentration of infrastructure. Core samples would provide material for detailed laboratory analysis. Carbon dating could establish construction dates with precision. Spectroscopic analysis could identify any residues present in the conduit interior. Microscopic examination could reveal wear patterns or material deposits. The methodology is established and relatively inexpensive per sample. Comprehensive sampling has not occurred because it requires permission to damage heritage infrastructure, permission that is granted for maintenance and safety purposes, but not routinely for historical research questions whose importance remains debated. The reason these technologies have not been systematically applied is not that anyone actively prevents their use. It is that no individual or institution has yet assembled the necessary combination of funding, access permissions, and professional motivation to prioritize this question above other research opportunities. The technology waits, the conduits wait, and the question remains unanswered, not because it is forbidden, but because it exists in administrative and institutional gaps where responsibility is unclear and priorities are allocated elsewhere. There is one more thing to consider before we return to the conduit itself. During maintenance work on the Melbourne Underground rail loop system in the late 2000s and 10s, workers occasionally reported finding chambers and structures that did not appear on current infrastructure maps. These reports are mentioned in maintenance logs and occasionally in internal communications, though typically without detailed documentation or follow-up investigation. One such report from 2019 describes a chamber at depth beneath the intersection of Swanston and Collins Streets, lined with materials consistent with 19th century construction techniques, containing mounting brackets or fixtures whose purpose was not immediately clear to the maintenance crew. The report was noted, filed, and the crew continued with their scheduled work. No archaeological assessment was triggered because the finding did not meet the threshold for mandatory heritage review. It was not assessed as being of sufficient immediate significance or risk, and project schedules did not include budget for non-critical investigations. This is not suppression. This is the normal operation of infrastructure maintenance, where discoveries are documented but not investigated unless they pose immediate concerns or clearly fall within mandatory heritage protection protocols. The mounting brackets in that reported chamber, if the description is accurate, would have held something. The chamber served some purpose within the broader 19th century construction of underground Melbourne. The conduits that thread beneath these streets connect to something that was either never completed as intended, or was completed and subsequently removed or abandoned. We have incomplete documentation of what that something was. We call these remnants old infrastructure. We call them historical utilities. We call them Victorian remnants. What we do not have is comprehensive evidence to determine definitively what they represent. Incomplete ambitious planning, temporary exhibition infrastructure built to permanent specifications, early electrical experimentation that predated standardized systems, or some combination of these possibilities. And now, one final return to the conduit. In the basement of the Melbourne Town Hall, if you could gain access through the proper permit channels, there are sections of wall where the stonework changes texture, where the blocks become smaller and more precisely fitted, where the mortar shows different composition. Some of these sections show evidence of sealed openings, circular profiles approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, filled and plastered over, but detectably different in texture from the surrounding stonework. The fill material in some cases is softer, suggesting later addition rather than original construction. According to fragmentary references in 1880s building assessment documents held in the Melbourne City Council archives, there were conduit connections to this building that linked it to other structures in the city centre. The conduits are still there in some form. Ground surveys conducted for recent renovations confirm subsurface structures consistent with 19th century utility construction. The openings were sealed at some point, likely in the early 20th century when utility systems were standardized and older infrastructure was decommissioned or bypassed. What ran through those conduits is a question that cannot be definitively answered without further physical evidence. The conduits could represent incomplete electrical planning, optimistic infrastructure built for a permanent system that was never fully implemented due to economic constraints. They could represent temporary exhibition infrastructure built to permanent specifications because builders expected later use. They could represent early electrical experimentation that operated briefly before being superseded by more standardized systems. They could represent planning for electrical infrastructure that was delayed by the 1890s depression and then rendered obsolete by newer technologies when the economy recovered. All of these explanations have some support in fragmentary evidence. None can be confirmed without more comprehensive investigation. The conduit is real. The sealed openings are real. The underground channels documented in archaeological reports are real. What we do not possess is sufficient evidence to determine their full history and purpose. We have pieces of physical infrastructure that suggest intentions whose full scope remains unclear. We have documentary fragments that describe plans and demonstrations without always clearly distinguishing between what was projected and what was accomplished. We have a historical record that became less detailed during a period of economic crisis, making it difficult to trace what happened to infrastructure projects that were underway when the crisis hit. And this is perhaps the most important point. Not that someone is hiding something, but that the evidence we have is genuinely incomplete and ambiguous. Infrastructure from the 1880s exists beneath Melbourne. Its intended purpose is not fully documented in surviving records. Its actual use may have fallen short of its intended purpose, or may have been brief, or may have been more extensive than later simplified accounts suggest. Without systematic physical investigation using modern analytical techniques, combined with more comprehensive archival research than has yet been conducted, we cannot resolve these ambiguities definitively. The structures we have built to organize knowledge are capable of leaving certain questions unasked, not through malice, but through the practical limitations of how research is funded, categorized, and prioritized. A question that falls between established disciplines, that requires significant access permissions to answer definitively, that challenges elements of accepted narratives without yet having comprehensive evidence to offer a full alternative account. Such a question can remain unresolved not because it is forbidden, but because it is difficult, and because difficulty without clear institutional ownership means that other research priorities take precedence. The conduit beneath Melbourne, beneath the footings of buildings we use daily, waits for someone to assemble the resources, permissions, and institutional support necessary to investigate it comprehensively. The technology exists. The methodology exists. The access could theoretically be arranged. What does not easily exist is the institutional category that would make such investigation a natural priority for any single organization or discipline. And so the question remains open, answerable in principle, but unanswered in practice, present beneath our feet as we walk above infrastructure whose full story we have not yet reconstructed.